Welcome to our catch-up of Hebrews as we study it in our home meetings. And this week we've been looking at Hebrews chapter 7, verse 1 through chapter 8, verse 6. And as we were meeting, the very first question that came was, so who was this Melchizedek? And that seems a very good place to start because that's Hebrews chapter 7, verse 1. So who was this Melchizedek? He was both the king of Salem and the prince of God Most High. He met Abraham after he had defeated the kings and blessed him. In response, Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. The name Melchizedek means, first of all, the king of righteousness. His title, King of Salem, means that he is king of peace. He had no parents, no forebears. There was no point at which he began life or a moment in time when his life ended. In other words, like God's Son, he remains a priest forever. Melchizedek's a very strange character, but as we read that, we begin to see that he is a type of Christ. And this whole passage is swinging around the fact that Abraham went and tithed to Melchizedek. And it's pretty complicated because it's all about Aaron and his children and all of those things. But really what it's saying is that when the priests of the time were tithing and people were tithing to them, they were tithing back into the natural. But when Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, he tithed to someone who was better. And because of the way that he describes it, that Aaron was in the loins of Abraham through Levi and through the patriarchs, it's showing that this is something so different. And those titles that a Melchizedek is given are the titles that we see for Jesus. He's speaking there of the King of Peace, and we know Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Jesus is our King and High Priest. And these verses put it out so straight. Because remember what we're looking at here is that we're looking at people who came out of Judaism and saw everything fulfilled, the covenants of the past fulfilled in Jesus. And with excitement, they began to run. But when trouble came, when difficulties came, they began to shrink back and began to find themselves being pulled back into the old. And the author is making it so plain that what we have is so much better. And so he then asks in verse 10, what do we learn from this? That the priesthood of Melchizedek was superior to that of Levi. If it was possible for the Levitical priesthood to be perfect, and remember that the law given to the people recognized this priesthood had descended from Aaron, why was it necessary for another priest to come? Not one like Aaron, but in the lineage of Melchizedek. A change in priesthood implies a change in law. A change in priesthood implies a change in law. Something has changed. The author is making it plain that you've gone from one time to another. Time and time in Hebrews, we're spotting the difference, that the covenant has changed. We've moved from one time to another. We don't live in the old anymore. We live in the new. Don't go back to the old when the new is so much better. And verse 15 and 16, it is clear then that if another priest appears, one that is like Melchizedek, his priesthood is not based on the regulations of the law, but on the fact that he ministers in the power of an eternal, indestructible life. That is why you said, you are a priest, an eternal priest in the lineage of Melchizedek. There it is. Jesus is a high priest. And what is the power of that? That he lives an indestructible life. The people would be able to say, wow, I actually see what you're talking about. Something that might seem like an insignificant little story back in Genesis is actually a key to speaking that God had a plan from the very beginning. He knew what was coming. He knew the need, and from the very beginning, he had it all set up. And if we read Hebrews 7:19 and on, it is certain that nothing was ever made perfect by the law. Now something far better has replaced it, by which we have a much better hope for the future, and by which it has now been made possible for us to draw really close to God himself. Just catch hold of that in verse 19. We've something better. Everything we've been talking about in Hebrews is speaking that the new covenant is better than the old. Something better has replaced it. And now we have a better hope for the future. A better hope for the future. A better hope for the future. Something better. We have something that has gone from something that was to something that is better. In verse 20 we read on, and now this new and better way was established by the promises he gave under the solemn oath. No oath was sworn by God in establishing the Levitical priesthood under the law. That's really interesting because it's something we might miss. But God has made this by an oath. He's sworn by himself. Something he didn't do in the Old Testament. He has sworn by himself. When God swears a promise on his own honor, his word cannot be changed. God said of his Son, the Lord has taken an oath and will never change his mind. You are an eternal priest. He refers, of course, to the priesthood of Jesus, who guarantees that we are part of a better covenant. Again, it's a better covenant. And we are able to enjoy a close relationship with God. A close relationship with God that was possible under the law, the old covenant and its former human priesthood. We've got something that is so much better, so much more wonderful, so much more powerful, so much. And can you not just see the author is saying, what are you going back to this ritual for? What are you going back to these traditions for? Even what are you going back to the old way of life for? Because there is something so much better here. Something that meets every need. Something that has brought you into life and out of death. And Hebrews 7:26 tells us that we have such a wonderful and eternal high priest who is able, therefore, to meet every need we could ever have. For he is holy, blameless, pure, totally different in nature from sinners, and he is now exalted and reigning in heaven. He is so perfect. He is so wonderful. He is sinless. He is blameless. He is holy. And he is interceding for us. He is stood at the very right hand of God in the very temple in heaven, interceding for us, making our way. That's just amazing as we move on to verse 28. The law could only appoint weak men as high priests, but this solemn promise God appointed his own Son as high priest, and he is eternally perfect. So the weaknesses of the law is now superseded by the perfection of Christ. And chapter 8, verse 1, the reason we speak these things is simply this. We do have an eternal high priest who has sat down at the right hand of the majesty of God in heaven. He is the one who serves eternally in the true sanctuary, the holy of holies in heaven, created by God and not man. What a thing that in heaven there is the true holy of holies. Man, at God's instruction, made an image of it so that he could be constantly reminded of God's sovereignty and his need for a savior. Jesus is that savior. Jesus is that one who stands in the gap. And we are privileged to be part of that sanctuary. He has made us to be part of him. And 8 verse 5, they serve in a sanctuary that was only an imitation of the shadow of the one in heaven. For it was this reason that God warned Moses when he ordered him to build the tabernacle. Be sure that you make everything according to the plans I have shown you on the mountain. Yet the priestly ministry Jesus has received is so far superior to that of this eternal earthly priesthood, just as the new covenant he has established is far superior to the old covenant. It has been founded on better promises given by God. This new covenant is better than everything that went before. It's on a better promise. You know, perhaps the one thing we should be thinking about is if they obeyed that covenant that was an inferior covenant, how much more should we obey a covenant and be part into a covenant that is on better promises and better hope with a better high priest, and everything about it is better. We have a better covenant. Next week we're going to continue, and we're going to be looking through chapter 8 verse 7 into chapter 9 verse 20, and look forward to being with you then.